The story does not begin with crowds in the streets or flags sliding down poles. It begins far from cameras and chants, inside quiet rooms where the hum of fluorescent lights never stops. Clerks sit at metal desks. Papers stack higher each year. Calculators click late into the night. On the surface, everything looks orderly. Reports are filed. Targets are met. Production numbers rise. Yet something fundamental is breaking beneath the paperwork. Ledgers no longer balance in ways that reflect real life. Factories declare success while nearby stores run out of soap, meat, and shoes. This is where the collapse truly begins. Not with noise, but with silence. Not with rebellion, but with numbers that stop meaning what they once did. For decades, the Soviet Union was explained to the world through ideology. It fell, many say, because belief collapsed, because people lost faith, because politics failed. Those explanations are neat. They are comforting, and they are incomplete. Beneath ideology sat an economic machine that slowly turned against itself. This was not an accident. It was not sudden. It was a long process in which economic reality was bent, managed, delayed, and finally denied. What unfolded was not just a failure of planning or leadership. It was something more severe. It was economic self-destruction, carried out one regulation, one frozen price, and one falsified report at a time. The Soviet state promised certainty. That promise mattered more than ideology. Citizens were told that tomorrow was secured. Jobs were guaranteed. Prices were fixed. Housing was planned. The future was scheduled years in advance. In a world shaped by wars, depressions, and chaos, certainty became power. It bound people to the system. It allowed an empire to stretch across continents without falling apart. The promise was simple and powerful. No matter what happened elsewhere, life here would be stable. That promise became the foundation of authority itself. But certainty always has a cost. Someone must absorb the risk. Someone must pay for stability when reality changes. In market systems, prices move. They rise and fall. They signal scarcity and abundance. In the Soviet system, prices were not signals. They were commands. Bread cost what the state said it cost. Wages paid what the plan required. Losses were absorbed by ministries. Profits were irrelevant. The purpose of money changed. It stopped measuring reality and started enforcing it. As long as the system expanded, this distortion stayed hidden. Growth covered mistakes. Resources masked inefficiency. Power disguised fragility. But when growth slowed, the lies became heavier. Each frozen price required a subsidy. Each subsidy required another distortion. The system began feeding on itself. Imagine an economy where failure does not exist. Factories cannot close. Enterprises cannot go bankrupt. Production targets must be met, even if the output is useless. When demand disappears, supply continues anyway. Goods pile up in warehouses. Meanwhile, other shelves remain empty. This is not chaos. It is order without feedback. It is planning without correction. The Soviet Union perfected this condition. Reports flowed upward filled with success. Reality stayed below, uncounted and uncorrected. Over time, the distance between paper and life grew dangerous. Think about that. When information becomes performance, truth becomes a threat. The world saw strength. Rockets pierced the sky. Steel flowed from blast furnaces. Armies marched in perfect lines. From the outside, the system looked disciplined and unstoppable. That image was not false. It was incomplete. Military and heavy industry received priority. Consumer needs did not. The system chose power over comfort, projection over satisfaction. As long as citizens accepted scarcity as normal, the trade seemed workable. But scarcity is not static. It grows. It mutates. It spreads into daily life. When shortages stop feeling temporary, belief begins to crack. Inside ministries, officials knew problems existed, but the structure punished honesty. Reporting shortages meant admitting failure. Admitting failure threatened careers and stability. So numbers were adjusted. Shortfalls were reclassified. Targets were redefined. The economy became a theater of success, where applause mattered more than outcomes. Each layer of administration passed distortion upward. By the time data reached decision-makers, it no longer described reality. Plans were written based on fiction. Corrections addressed symptoms, not causes. The system began making decisions blindfolded, convinced it could still see. Money plays a critical role in any complex society. It coordinates effort. It aligns incentives. It translates needs into action. In the Soviet system, money lost that role. It became symbolic rather than functional. Wages arrived regardless of output. Prices stayed constant regardless of scarcity. Savings accumulated without meaningful choices. Citizens learned that money could not buy what mattered. Access replaced currency. Favors replaced prices. Connections replaced markets. An unofficial economy emerged alongside the official one. It was not ideological rebellion. It was survival. People adapted quietly while the state pretended nothing had changed. This is where the idea of economic suicide becomes unavoidable. The system did not collapse because enemies attacked it. It collapsed because it attacked its own feedback mechanisms. By freezing prices, it silenced signals. By guaranteeing outcomes, it eliminated accountability. By punishing failure, it eliminated learning. Each choice made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a trap. The more the system protected certainty, the more fragile it became, the more it denied reality, the more power slipped away unnoticed. Think about the scale of the contradiction. A state capable of extraordinary scientific and military achievement could not reliably distribute basic goods. A system that planned decades ahead could not respond to shortages lasting months. This was not incompetence. It was structural blindness. Economic reality kept changing. The plan refused to acknowledge it. Over time, the cost of denial grew too large to hide. Subsidies drained resources. Inefficiency multiplied. Productivity stagnated. Yet reports continued to show success. The gap widened. Something had to give. Citizens felt the strain long before collapse became visible. Lines grew longer. Quality declined. Work lost meaning. When effort no longer changed outcomes, motivation eroded. People did what was required, not what was needed. The social contract weakened. The promise of certainty began to feel hollow. Stability without improvement became stagnation. Stagnation bred quiet resentment, not rebellion, but withdrawal. People stopped believing that the system could deliver a better tomorrow. That loss of belief did not start with politics. It started with economics. The tragedy is that the system kept functioning just well enough to avoid immediate crisis. Oil revenues bought time. External trade masked inefficiencies. Central control delayed reckoning. Each delay made the eventual cost higher. Like a machine running without maintenance, it continued moving while wearing itself down. The collapse, when it came, would feel sudden, but its roots stretched back decades. This was not a fall. It was a slow descent disguised as stability. The central question, then, is not why the Soviet Union failed. It is how it survived for so long while dismantling its own foundations. How does a system persist after it has neutralized the very tools that allow economies to adapt? How long can power endure when money no longer tells the truth? These are not abstract questions. They are practical ones. They determine whether societies correct course or drift toward collapse without realizing it. This story is not about ideology alone. It is about incentives. It is about information. It is about the consequences of forcing reality to obey plans rather than allowing plans to respond to reality. The Soviet Union waged war on uncertainty. For a time, it won. It replaced risk with rules. It replaced markets with mandates. It replaced signals with slogans. On paper, it achieved stability. In reality, it accumulated fragility. As the chapters unfold, the illusion of strength will be examined piece by piece. The mechanisms that sustain the system will be revealed. The hidden costs will surface. What looks like confidence will reveal dependence. What looks like control will reveal fear. The economic suicide did not announce itself. It hid behind success until success itself became meaningless. Think about that. When numbers stop reflecting life, power stops understanding the world it governs. This is where the story truly begins. In rooms without windows. In reports written to satisfy, not to inform. In an economy that chose certainty over truth. The collapse that followed was not inevitable. It was engineered, quietly and patiently, by a system that believed it could command reality forever. From the outside, the Soviet economy looked indestructible. Steel mills glowed through the night. Smoke rose from factories that stretched the horizon. Trains moved endlessly across frozen plains, hauling coal, iron, grain, and machinery. Oil and gas flowed from distant fields through pipelines that crossed borders and time zones. Cities grew upward and outward, filled with apartment blocks that promised shelter for generations. Military parades rolled through wide avenues, each vehicle a signal of control, order, and endurance. To observers abroad, this was not a system in decline. It was a system that had mastered scale itself. Central planning stood at the heart of that image. The state claimed the ability to organize an entire society as if it were a single machine. Ministries replaced markets. 5-year plans replaced uncertainty. Production targets replaced prices. Everything had its place. Everything had its quota. The future was mapped in advance, measured in tons, units, and percentages. For a nation shaped by invasion, famine, and instability, this vision carried enormous appeal. It promised protection from chaos. It promised predictability in a dangerous world. And for a long time, it delivered just enough to make belief rational. In the early decades, growth felt real. Massive investment pushed heavy industry forward at extraordinary speed. Entire sectors appeared where none had existed before. Dams rose. Mines expanded. Factories multiplied. The economy did not need to be efficient to grow. It only needed resources and direction. Labor was abundant. Land was vast. Human cost was ignored. Under those conditions, central control could generate visible results. Production surged. Output increased. The numbers looked impressive. The image hardened. The Soviet economy became synonymous with strength. Scarcity never disappeared, but it was managed. Ration cards turned shortages into routines. Long lines became normal. People adjusted expectations downward. The system did not aim to satisfy demand. It aimed to control it. When demand exceeded supply, access was limited rather than prices raised. This avoided unrest, at least temporarily. Everyone suffered equally, in theory. Inequality was denied, even as privilege quietly expanded behind closed doors. The appearance of fairness mattered more than the experience of comfort. Subsidies played a crucial role in maintaining this balance. Basic goods were kept artificially cheap. Food, housing, transport, and energy were priced far below their real cost. This reinforced the promise of certainty. Life felt affordable. Wages, though modest, seemed sufficient, but someone had to absorb the difference between price and cost. The state did. Losses were covered not by efficiency, but by accounting. Enterprises did not need to survive. They needed to exist. Survival was guaranteed by design. This guarantee reshaped behavior. When failure carries no consequence, effort loses direction. Factories focused on meeting quotas, not serving needs. Quality became secondary. Durability declined. Innovation slowed. Why improve when output was rewarded, regardless of usefulness? Managers learned to game the system. Targets were negotiated downward. Inputs were hoarded. Outputs were exaggerated. The plan became something to satisfy, not something to follow. Still, the numbers flowed upward, showing progress. The illusion remained intact. On paper, uncertainty had been conquered. Employment was guaranteed. Inflation appeared non-existent. Growth targets were met. Stability seemed permanent. But this victory was achieved by silencing signals rather than solving problems. Prices could no longer warn of shortages. Wages could no longer reward productivity. Profits could no longer guide investment. The economy stopped reacting to reality. It began reacting to plans. When reality diverged from the plan, reality was ignored. Internationally, the system benefited from comparison. Capitalist economies faced recessions, unemployment, and financial crises. The Soviet model appeared immune. While others struggled with cycles, this system claimed linear progress. That contrast reinforced confidence at home and curiosity abroad. The narrative was powerful. Central planning had tamed the chaos of markets. The future belonged to those who could organize society scientifically. The belief was not absurd. It was supported by decades of visible expansion. Energy exports strengthened that belief. Oil and gas became lifelines. They generated hard currency. They paid for imports. They covered inefficiencies elsewhere. When domestic production faltered, energy revenues filled the gap. This masked deeper weaknesses. The economy appeared balanced because one sector compensated for many failures. Dependence grew quietly. As long as energy flowed and prices stayed favorable, the illusion held. Time was bought. Reform was postponed. Inside the system, complexity increased. Layers of administration multiplied. Each ministry oversaw its domain, insulated from consequences. Coordination became ceremonial. Communication moved upward through reports designed to please. Downward directives arrived disconnected from conditions on the ground. The economy grew rigid. Adjustments required permission. Permission required justification. Justification required data that did not exist or could not be trusted. So the system froze in place, proud of its stability. Citizens learned to live within these constraints. They adapted without challenging the structure. Informal networks emerged to compensate for shortages. People traded favors, not money. Access mattered more than income. Knowing someone inside a warehouse or office could matter more than wages. This parallel economy did not threaten the state openly. It supported daily life where the official economy failed. The contradiction deepened. The system survived because people worked around it. Despite this, belief persisted. Many still trusted the promise of certainty. The state had delivered peace, order, and basic security. That counted. The memory of chaos remained fresh enough to make stagnation tolerable. For a time, the trade seemed acceptable. But belief requires reinforcement. When living standards stop improving, patience thins. When effort brings no reward, loyalty erodes. These changes do not appear in statistics. They appear in behavior. The illusion of strength depended on silence. Silence about waste. Silence about inefficiency. Silence about declining quality. The system discouraged questions because questions expose contradictions. Criticism was framed as disloyalty. Reform was framed as risk. Stability became sacred. That mindset hardened over time. The economy was no longer a tool to serve society. It became a symbol to be defended. Protecting the image mattered more than fixing the machine. Think about that. Power sustained not by profit, but by performance. Control built not on truth, but on compliance. As long as people played their roles, the show continued. Factories produced because they were told to. Ships sailed because plans required movement. Goods crossed seas only to sit unused. Meanwhile, basic items disappeared from shelves. The contradiction grew sharper each year. Still, the image held. From a distance, the empire looked solid. This is why the eventual collapse shocked the world. Observers saw strength where fragility hid. They mistook scale for resilience. They mistook order for adaptability. They mistook control for understanding. The Soviet economy had mastered expansion, but not correction. It could build quickly. It could mobilize resources. It could command obedience. What it could not do was listen. And economies that cannot listen cannot learn. By the time warning signs became undeniable, the system was trapped by its own design. Adjusting prices risked unrest. Allowing failure risked exposure. Reducing subsidies risked collapse. Every lever pulled revealed another dependency. The illusion that once protected stability now threatened survival. The machinery kept moving, but its purpose had blurred. It existed to preserve itself, not to serve the people it governed. This chapter is about that illusion, about why it convinced so many for so long, about how visible strength masked internal weakness, about how a system can appear unstoppable while quietly hollowing itself out. The Soviet economy did not fall because it lacked power. It fell because it mistook power for sustainability. And the moment that illusion cracked, everything beneath it was already compromised. This was a high point, the era when certainty felt permanent and strength felt unquestionable. It was also the moment when the cost of denial had already accumulated beyond repair. The collapse had not yet begun, but the path toward it was firmly set. The cracks did not announce themselves with crisis. They spread quietly beneath the surface, like corrosion inside a seal machine. On paper, the system still worked. Plans were approved. Targets were issued. Reports showed compliance. But the connection between effort and outcome was breaking down. Fixed prices severed the link between work and reward. A factory that wasted materials survived just as easily as one that conserved them. An enterprise that produced unusable goods was treated no differently than one that met real needs. Efficiency stopped mattering because nothing depended on it. The economy continued to move, but it no longer learned. As prices froze, distortion deepened. When demand rose, prices could not signal scarcity. When supply failed, wages could not adjust behavior. Shortages appeared, but the system could not acknowledge them honestly. Instead, shortages were reframed as distribution issues or temporary disruptions. Ministries responded with directives rather than corrections. Produce more, ship faster, report success. The response was always administrative, never economic. Each fix ignored the cause. Each delay increased the cost. Money, once meant to coordinate millions of decisions, became symbolic. It still existed, but it no longer guided action. Wages arrived on time, regardless of output. Savings accumulated without meaningful choice. You could have money and still lack access. You could work harder and still gain nothing. Gradually, people learned that money did not reflect value. It reflected compliance. Real value moved elsewhere. Access replaced currency. Relationships replaced prices. The informal economy grew not out of greed but necessity. This divergence between the official economy and the real one widened year by year. Official data showed stability. Daily life showed scarcity. Reports described fulfillment. Citizens described waiting. The contradiction became impossible to ignore, but acknowledging it threatened the system itself. If prices were adjusted, they would expose years of distortion. If subsidies were cut, living standards would collapse. If enterprises were allowed to fail, the illusion of full employment would vanish. Every correction carried political risk. So corrections were postponed. Energy exports delayed the reckoning. Oil and gas revenues brought in foreign currency. They paid for imports. They stabilized budgets. They created the impression that the system still functioned. But this was not reform. It was insulation. Dependence on energy deepened structural weakness. Other sectors stagnated. Productivity lagged. Innovation slowed further. The economy became unbalanced, leaning heavily on a narrow base. When external conditions shifted, the cushion thinned. As pressures mounted, behavior changed. Managers hoarded inputs, unsure when supplies would arrive again. Production schedules became defensive. Meeting quotas mattered more than meeting needs. Output was shaped to satisfy metrics, not people. Goods were produced in the wrong sizes, wrong quantities, wrong places. Warehouses filled with items no one wanted. Meanwhile, essentials disappeared. The system produced abundance and shortage at the same time. Citizens adapted quietly. They queued early. They traded favors. They stockpiled when possible. Work became ritual rather than purpose. Effort was calibrated to expectation, not ambition. When improvement becomes impossible, survival becomes the goal. This shift was subtle, but devastating. Motivation eroded. Trust declined. The social contract weakened. The promise of certainty began to feel like confinement. The black market grew not as rebellion, but as correction. It reflected real demand. It responded to scarcity. It rewarded effort. In many ways, it functioned better than the official economy. That reality was dangerous. It demonstrated that the system's rules were a problem, but acknowledging that would require admitting failure. So the state tolerated the informal economy while publicly denying its existence. Another contradiction. Another layer of denial. Reform became inevitable and impossible at the same time. Leaders understood that stagnation could not continue, but reform threatened exposure. Adjusting prices would reveal how artificial stability had been. Allowing failure would reveal how many enterprises survived only on paper. Reducing subsidies would reveal how dependent citizens had become. Truth, once released, could not be contained. The system had optimized itself for obedience, not adaptation. It could command. It could not adjust. Attempts to fix the economy revealed its fragility. Small changes produced outsized effects. A minor price adjustment triggered hoarding. A limited reform caused supply disruptions. Each experiment confirmed fear. Reform appeared dangerous because the system had become brittle. Years of suppressed signals had eliminated flexibility. The economy could no longer absorb shocks. It had lost resilience. Stability had been purchased by sacrificing adaptability. This was a turning point. Not a single event, but a realization. The The system was trapped by its own success. It had built an empire on certainty, but certainty had frozen it in place. Every solution required honesty. Every honest move threatened collapse. Leaders faced an impossible choice: continue denial and drift toward stagnation, or confront reality and risk immediate chaos. Either path carried consequences. Delay seemed safer. Delay always seemed safer. Think about the paradox. A state with vast resources could not fix simple shortages without unraveling itself. A system designed to plan everything could not plan reform. Control had become a liability. The tools that once delivered stability now prevented correction. The economy did not run out of material. It ran out of usable truth. Information no longer described reality. Decisions no longer improved outcomes. Power lost its compass. As trust eroded, cohesion weakened. Regions questioned the center. Enterprises ignored directives. Citizens disengaged. The economy became fragmented. Coordination failed quietly. The center issued plans that no one fully followed. The appearance of unity masked practical disintegration. The machine still existed, but its parts no longer moved together. This chapter is where illusion turns into danger, where denial becomes destructive, where the economic mechanism that sustained power begins to dismantle it. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it lacked resources or intelligence. It collapsed because it made truth incompatible with stability. And when truth finally forced its way back in, the system had no way to absorb it. From this point on, collapse was not a question of if, but how. The structure was compromised. The feedback loops were broken. The economy could no longer coordinate reality. Power slipped through the cracks created by its own design. What followed would feel sudden. It would feel dramatic. But it was the result of a long process reaching its final stage. The war on economic reality had been won on paper. In the real world, the cost was about to be paid. When the collapse finally arrived, it felt abrupt only to those watching from a distance. To the people living inside the system, it felt like the last stage of something already familiar. Stores emptied faster than explanations could be written. Lines grew longer, then meaningless. Wages were paid, but they no longer translated into food, fuel, or security. Money arrived on schedule and failed on contact with reality. The promise that had once held everything together, certainty, evaporated almost overnight. What remained was confusion, fear, and a quiet realization that the center could no longer provide. The system had been designed to eliminate uncertainty. Instead, it produced the most dangerous form of it. No one knew what tomorrow would bring. Not citizens, not managers, not officials. Supply chains fractured as coordination failed. Enterprises waited for instructions that never arrived or arrived too late. Regions began solving problems on their own. The logic was simple. If the center could not deliver, obedience no longer made sense. Economic failure translated into political fragmentation, not because of ideology, but because of necessity. Savings disappeared without warning. Years of work dissolved as prices adjusted chaotically. The hidden distortions of decades were released all at once. What had been suppressed gradually now surfaced violently. Subsidies vanished. Shortages intensified. Inequality, long denied, became visible and extreme. Trust, already thin, collapsed completely. People stopped believing not just in the system, but in its promises, its rules, and its future. The collapse exposed how little resilience remained. There were no buffers left, no reliable signals, no shared expectations. The economy could not coordinate recovery because it had lost the mechanisms to do so. Money no longer guided action. Plans no longer commanded obedience. Authority no longer aligned effort. The structure that once enforced order now amplified chaos. What had been rigid shattered under pressure. Republics began to question the logic of remaining bound to a failing center. If economic survival required local control, then political separation followed naturally. This was not driven first by nationalism or ideology. It was driven by supply, by wages, by food, by fuel. When economic systems fail, borders lose meaning. Authority follows resources, not flags. The empire did not fracture because people suddenly changed their beliefs. It fractured because coordination stopped working. From the outside, the collapse was framed as sudden, as dramatic, as inevitable. Inside, it felt like exhaustion, like the end of pretending. People had adapted for years. They had queued, they had traded favors, they had lowered expectations. When the system finally broke, there was little left to defend. The promise of certainty had already died. What followed was not revolution. It was release. The aftermath was brutal. Supply networks that once functioned, however inefficiently, disappeared. Industries collapsed without protection. Employment vanished where it had once been guaranteed. The transition was not smooth. It was painful and uneven. Some adapted quickly. Others fell behind. The cost was enormous. But the illusion could not be restored. Once truth re-entered the system, there was no returning to denial. The lesson of this collapse is often misunderstood. It is not a simple story about ideology losing to another ideology. It is a story about systems that punish truth and reward illusion, about economies that silence feedback and then act surprised when coordination fails, about power structures that mistake control for understanding. The Soviet Union did not fall because it planned too much. It fell because it planned without listening. Think about that. When prices lie, decisions fail. When money stops signaling reality, power becomes blind. When failure is forbidden, learning disappears. These dynamics are not unique. They are universal. Any system, regardless of ideology, that suppresses honest information courts the same fate. Collapse does not require invasion. It does not require rebellion. Sometimes, it only requires time. Modern states still face these pressures. Subsidies are still used to delay costs. Data is still shaped to preserve narratives. Short-term stability is still purchased at the expense of long-term resilience. The Soviet story is not distant history. It is a warning written in empty shells, silent factories, and numbers that stop meaning what they claim to measure. The economic suicide of the Soviet Union was not an act of madness. It was a result of rational choices made under fear. Fear of instability. Fear of unrest. Fear of admitting mistakes. Each choice postponed reckoning. Each delay deepened dependence. Each layer of denial narrowed the path forward. By the time reality asserted itself, there was no safe way to respond. This is how systems end, not with a single failure, but with accumulated avoidance, not with one wrong decision, but with many decisions that all seem reasonable in isolation. The final collapse is loud. The process leading to it is quiet. It happens in reports adjusted, prices frozen, and truths deferred. It happens when stability becomes more important than honesty. The Soviet Union did not lose control in a moment. It lost it slowly by dismantling the mechanisms that connect power to reality. When those mechanisms failed, authority followed. What remained was a lesson written in scale and consequence. Economic reality can be delayed. It cannot be denied forever. And when it returns, it does not negotiate. If the story added clarity, if it helped you see history through the lens of economics rather than slogans, consider subscribing for more deep, cinematic explorations like this. And if you believe these lessons matter beyond the past, share this documentary so others can see how power truly rises and how it quietly falls.